2 days and 1 river crossing later, a hunting pack of gnolls brought in the corpse of a manticore. It was 5 meters long from the tip of its spiked tail to the front of its strange, human-like face. Reptilian wings that QRS imagined what a dragon might have spanned as wide as it was long. The beast's black tongue lolled out from between rows of serrated teeth. What was that about old enemies and old friends again? QRS asked Zverith. It occurred to a few of us that if we became too resilient to its attacks, Zverith replied, it would simply give up and hunt elsewhere. This felt like a wasted opportunity, so we crafted an ambush. One of us took a spine and pretended to be felled out on the field. The manticore came down to retrieve its kill at night, and became the hunted instead. The corpse of the manticore was set down near the shore of the river, where the gathered gnolls set about dismantling their kill. QRS wrinkled his nose as an atrocious stench filled the air. Manticores are highly poisonous, Zverith continued, so our friend here will not be useful for food. Its hide will be fashioned into several sets of leather armor, and the poison can be extracted from its body. We will see how Yaldabaoth's minions enjoy the taste of our poisoned arrows the next time they come our way. There've been no further sightings of Yaldabaoth or his minions since the ford, by your reports. This is true, Zverith nodded. But we will be spending the winter around here somewhere. He may finish with the tribes in the neck during that time and continue eastward. I'd rather he head south and play with that slain theocracy. A hopeful thought, but we must make ourselves ready should he move in our direction instead. QRS looked up from watching the gnolls work on the manticore corpse, sweeping his gaze out across the grassland. After their crossing, he knew it to not be very wide, but it was still far enough that the forests of the neck could not be seen. I know that the last of us are on our way out of there, QRS said, but could we leave some sentries back in the neck to keep watch? That is my intent, yes, Zverith told him. Throughout the winter, our packs will be roving around as they usually do. We'll have ample warning should new movement be spotted to the west. What about the east? QRS asked, have you found a way over the mountains yet? We effectively have our backs to, well, a mountain until then. I've sent several dozen bands of scouts to search for the best passes. Avad has sent our armies to scour the forests on this side of the undead. We should know what we need to know within a few days. I see, QRS breathed. Then I guess all there is to do is wait. Zverith nodded and went on her own way, and QRS was quickly accosted by several of his tribal elders, who had been waiting nearby. Does that mean we should delay our preparations? One of them asked. We'll still be here for at least a few days yet, QRS answered, so we can at least get a few things done. We've still got plenty of people on their way, so places need to be made for them. Have there been any problems with what we talked about earlier? All understand the necessity of consolidating the tribes, the elder replied. We've selected 3 sites for our winter villages, and the people are quite pleased with the locations. This forest is lush with nature's bounty. Once the undead have been cleared away, we should be able to sustain ourselves easily. QRS slowly nodded his head in agreement. With all that had happened, this rich forest with its few threats was a welcome reprieve for the weary refugees, though they still couldn't figure out what had happened to its former inhabitants. He had personally led a warband to one of the ruined villages near one of the locations for their new settlements, easily sweeping away the weak undead within. The buildings were constructed from some combination of wood and stone, crumbled and burnt away as the scouting reports had initially described. There were distinct markings carved on the stone here and there, but he had no idea what any of it meant. Time had worn away what belongings remained, leaving the few unburned rooms with nothing left but dust and decay. So far, the scouts had reported many villages in a similar condition, as well as several stone towers that also lay broken and ruined. Judging by the size of the structures, QRS decided that those who once dwelled here were around his height, or perhaps a bit shorter. The presence of the undead in this otherwise vibrant land suggested that the people here were subjected to some event that destroyed them in their entirety. War or plague were likely candidates, leaving behind a miasma of violence, suffering and anguish in its wake to create areas steeped in the curse of undeath. The lack of undead anywhere but within these settlements meant that their fate had befallen them before they even had a chance to flee. QRS thought it a shame. without the unsettling idea that something might appear to take them in the same way as the forest's former inhabitants had mysteriously vanished, and the idea that Yaldabaoth might appear to attack them at any moment, he thought that he might have been happy to call the beautiful place home. Several days passed uneventfully, with more and more of the refugees making the journey across the grasslands. They had been divided into their separate races to minimize incidents along the way, though slaves were still made out of the most problematic to fuel the dwarven trade. The grouchy merchants always seemed to find reasons to drive up their prices and devalue the slaves that were offered in exchange, yet they reliably came regardless, always selling their entire inventory. The hobgoblin army appeared to have hit its stride, its many detachments moving to systematically exterminate the undead. They had even located and overwhelmed some sort of undead castellaring in one of the old towers, finding a small trove of magic items and various curiosities. The gnolls, too, started returning with their reports. A usable pass had been located, conveniently located at the top of the valley where they were camped, and additional scouts had been sent to investigate the other side. They would hear of what awaited them soon. That evening, QRS made his way to the pavilion to meet with the council and discuss their most recent findings. Within stood Zvrith and Avad at their customary places around the brazier, but only a few of their subordinates were present. QRS elders, too, had declined to attend what they considered an unimportant meeting in favor of organizing their growing settlements. He assumed that the others were missing as well for related reasons. Their time in the forest had been peaceful, and the idea that they would need to start planning for the coming winter was on everyone's minds. "I guess this will be quick," QRS said, "unless we've gotten a good idea of what's on the other side of these mountains." "We have," Avad said. "We've got some good news and some bad news." "Which news will we have to deal with first?" QRS asked. "The good news, I guess," Avad answered. "The area on the other side is a large, highland basin between the range here and another one further east. The land's even better than the forests on this side, and we found a bunch of tribes living there as you'd expect. It's highly defensible, protected by mountains and ridges on all sides." "All right, this bad news has to be extremely bad if you're putting it alongside this." "It is," Avad said. "Every way out of the basin is into human territory." QRS tamped down the simmering anger at the mere mention of the disgusting race. Everything was going so well, why did they have to appear now? "I thought this basin was supposed to be large," QRS said. "How did you find out about humans so quickly?" "We've only started poking our noses in," Avad told him. "The information about humans is from the handful of goblin tribes we've run into so far. The only ways out of the basin are this pass above us, over the ridge into the plains to the south, or north along the river flowing out of the highlands." "What about the range further east?" "They say that they're impassable," Avad replied, "and just looking at the other side from the pass up here seems to support that idea. Maybe if we had some winged goblins." "There's winged goblins?" It was a joke. QRS crossed his arms, sighing in consternation over the ideal location with its less than ideal human neighbors. If there were tribes in the basin. "How long have these tribes been living in this basin?" he asked. "As long as they can remember," Avad answered, "out of those that my officers have asked." If that was the case, it was possible that they could still winter in the basin, then strike out afterwards. Both the humans of the wall and those of the slain theocracy appeared to only go as far as their immediate borders when it came to their conflicts with the wilderness tribes. "What do they say about these humans?" QRS asked. "Do they behave like the ones we know of? What of walls and fortifications? Our attacks might not be stopped by them, but they'll get in the way of everyone else when we decide to move on." "There's no mention of any fortifications, and there's no need. The terrain itself is barrier after natural barrier. Rivers and falls, cliffs and canyons, ridges and mountains. The locals appear to divide the humans into northern and southern groups. For either direction, however, they consider incursion into human lands tantamount to suicide." Avad's voice trailed off, and she pursed her lips. "What?" QRS frowned at the rare expression. "These humans, both groups reportedly worship the 6 great gods. The same gods as the humans of the slain theocracy. Actually, they claim that the humans to the south are the slain theocracy, if you can believe that." "That wasn't possible, was it?" "The slain theocracy was the human nation south of the neck. If they were also south of this basin over the mountains, that would make this human nation at least as large as the Abelian wilderness itself. Such a weak race shouldn't be able to hold on to such a vast amount of territory. It appeared that they were everywhere, for that matter. Behind the wall to the west, the cursed chef was mentioned to be from the north of the hills, the elven lands of Evansa and the theocracy were to the south, and now this. It seemed that humans and their ilk were more plentiful than even goblins. Is there any truth to what they're saying? QRS asked. We have only their accounts to go on, Avad answered, but their tales were taken by different officers in different places, and they all match. There's one thing that stands out, too. The humans in the south share the same practice of conducting raids against the tribes as the humans near the neck. It could simply be due to having a shared religion, though. According to some of the people we've picked up along the way, these gods of theirs put humans above all others, and demand our deaths. Then what about the humans in the north? Are you saying that they worship the same gods, yet don't raid the tribes? According to my scouts, Zvrith told him, the way north is more difficult to traverse. Aside from the floor of the deep canyon that the river follows, only a few narrow passes offer a way through. That was something, at least. If they entered the basin, it was likely that they would be able to defend their position as long as they could deal with attacks from the humans to the south. While doing so, they could strike at the northern humans until they had been softened up enough to break through and continue their flight. If there were plenty of human settlements to raid, they wouldn't even need to gather food for the winter, they could just raid their way north. I bet you're thinking about hitting those humans in the north, Avad smirked. I am. QRS looked up from his thoughts. What of it? Maybe it's nothing, but I should warn you of at least one other thing. The tribes we've spoken to have offered a sort of puzzle. A puzzle? Yep, she nodded. The lands in the south have been turned into fields and farms, teeming with humans and their settlements. The lands in the north remain mostly wild, as far as the tribes know, so the numbers of humans dwelling there should be sparse by comparison. Yet the tribes here don't consider trying to push them out for their territories. That doesn't make any sense, QRS frowned. If the human presence in the north is weak, why wouldn't they? I don't know for certain, Avad said. But the thought borders on taboo amongst the locals. According to them, raids, even small scouting parties, don't return. There are cunning traps laid all over the border, and the inhabitants are said to be absolutely ruthless. Once you enter these humans' territory, they will relentlessly hunt you down. They don't sound like the humans west of our old home at all, who cower behind their fortifications and break so easily. QRS scoffed, trying to imagine a puny human capable of what the hobgoblin general had described. It sounds like an overblown rumor, he said. A fanciful tale, even. Are they even sure that those are humans? Sounds more like some sort of monster living there. That's just what we've heard, Avad shrugged. I just thought I'd mention it. The reason why the south is considered a threat is easy enough to understand, but the north is decidedly strange. Well, we'll find out for ourselves soon enough. That's my thinking, QRS nodded. The question is when we should start to occupy this basin. How many can we move through this pass in a day? It's a pretty wide pass that goes through a gap between high peaks, Avad told him. If we need to, we can probably move everyone in a few days. Since it looks like we have some leeway, I'd like to do this properly with the Goblin army. We'll move through and set up base camps, subjugating the area piece by piece and adding to our forces. We can keep our non-combatants on this side so they can keep working in safety and deal with the Dark Dwarves. Our gobs can keep a supply train going between here and the bases on the other side. The plan seemed solid. QRS couldn't find any faults with it, at least. The Hobgoblin General's mind for logistics and planning was far better than his own. The benefits for all were clear, and if Yaldabaoth was spotted in the neck, they could pack up and cross into the basin in good time. I don't see any problems with it for now, QRS said. Zvrith? The Null Matriarch shook her head, and QRS looked back at Avad. Looks like your army is finally getting its chance to shine, he told her. Once you're all done, we'll put this absurd tale of these locals to the test. Paul Milos grubbed away the afternoon's grime, savoring the sensation of cool water over his skin. After a long day out in the fields, he was looking forward to a relaxing evening with the neighbors, enjoying a hot meal with a cool drink in the refreshing breeze outside. The door to his house opened. He finished wiping himself off, putting on a fresh change of clothing. Pouring out 2 cups of water, he walked out of the kitchen. Along the way, he heard the familiar clatter of their skeleton helper and stepped over to one side. The undead laborer walked by without a look or a word, placing the baskets it was carrying onto the kitchen counter before heading to the corner to await new instructions. Paul paid it little mind, though a small part of him wondered how he had gotten used to the strange new life they had here. To call it strange was probably a colossal understatement. He and his wife were originally farmers displaced by the chaos following the kingdom of Rheastize's defeat at Katza Plains. They had become refugees, their village ruined by the fleeing wave of survivors from that disastrous battle. Even the fact that they had been so thoroughly beaten didn't stop the Lethied men, most of them farmers themselves, from stripping the rural villages bare of food and valuables before continuing on their way. The local authorities had either fled or were powerless to stop them. He and his wife managed to make it to Iranthal, finding a single cheap room in the city to shelter them, though the rent quickly drained away what little they had. Even with provisions being freely distributed by the new government, the situation was becoming untenable. His wife was with child, and there was no work in a city frozen by fear of the undead. Some were sent to the new king's lands in the northeast, but priority went to those displaced by the renovation of the Paupers district, and Paul's family wasn't one of the others chosen to go. Out of desperation, they had taken an offer of tenancy mentioned by the city cathedral. It had been one he had immediately refused upon hearing of it. The terms and conditions could best be described as honest, for the liege making the offer made no attempt to make it sound any better than it was, an undeveloped frontier land on the dangerous southwestern border. It was so remote that they needed to get there by boat. There were no priests, no markets, no tradesmen to service them, and the Lord controlled everything that went in and out of the territory. Housing, tools, food, everything was under the Lord's control, and they would be bound to that Lord for the next 10 years. Few people were living there, and the Lord's share was 9/10 ths of the harvest. The harshest of taxes he had ever heard of allowed tenants to keep double that amount, and even that meant slow starvation in almost every case. Yet, Paul had no choice. He had to take the contract, or perish in the city. It felt like they were selling themselves into a life of misery. And so, they were shipped upriver with a group of similarly desperate-looking people, to some far-off place in the mountains that sounded more like some sort of cruel prison camp for an evil aristocrat than anything else. Now, one season later, he felt a bit silly for not taking the offer in the first place. The description of the land, its conditions, and the terms of their tenancy were entirely accurate, yet it was not as someone like Paul would have imagined just from listening to the temple staff. The land was undeveloped and surrounded by untamed highlands and mountains, but it was also clean and cool and beautiful. Any concerns about their safety against wandering bandits and savage demi-human raiders were put to rest by the presence of powerful undead sentries both on land and in the skies above. There were still no priests, but places for markets and other services were built after their arrival, and medicines crafted by apothecaries from the city were provided. The local lord did control everything, but the young baroness appeared to be nothing but a genuine and benevolent border noble, one who conducted herself in the way that the scriptures would demand out of the aristocracy, yet you would never see practiced in earnest. Rather than being miserly, she was generous when it came to upholding her side of their contract. Tools, food and medicine were provided for the period up to the first harvest. Though the population was small, undead farmhands were provided. She even traveled from village to village to hold court, and the villagers saw her quite frequently. It was unlike other places where the only sign of the Lord you'd see was the tax collector, or maybe some adventurers hired to deal with a problem that was worth paying them for. Housing was particularly ridiculous. Their previous home had been a cottage of wattle and daub with a thatched roof. Like most rural cottages, it was a single combined living space. You slept, cooked, ate and worked all in the same small area. This new home, however, he doubted that any farmer had seen the like before. In the place of wattle and daub walls were walls fashioned from solid granite. Rather than thatch, clay tiles were used for the rooftops. The house itself was large, as well, larger than most homes in the city. It was larger than even the ladies' manor, which didn't make much sense. They had a yard around them too. He had the opportunity to ask Baroness Zaradnik why everything was so big. Maybe he shouldn't have requested an audience just for that, and her answer was so that fireballs cannot hit more than one home at once. Paul had no idea what to think about that. Did they actually have that problem? He spent the rest of that day in the field, occasionally glancing up to the sky to make sure that death wasn't about to come raining down on his head. The kitchen and dining room were divided into their own sections, and there was an even larger space that someone called a living room. There was an upstairs with 3 bedrooms, while a cellar with the same area as the main floor could be gotten into from inside the house. In the cellar was a hatch where they could escape into the sewer if the village was attacked. Oh yeah, they had a sewer, too. The place had all the comforts of a fancy city home and was far larger and more luxurious in construction. There was a bit of a wait for it, but his wife had fainted dead away on the street when he finally walked her up to their new home. "You there, Ma?" He called out to his wife, Elaine, who had not made a sound since entering. She was expecting in a month or 2, so Paul figured she had taken a seat to rest after going out to market. That was another nice thing about the skeleton helper, it allowed his wife to continue with most of her daily business even when heavy with child. She didn't reply, and Paul furrowed his brow as he came around the corner. Only the sound of rustling parchment in the air let him know that she was there at all. He found her seated at the dining room table, with a small booklet and a pile of papers in hand. "Ah, that's right, shares are being handed out today. The final sticking point in their tenant contract, the 10% share of their crops, would finally show itself." Working through the season, Paul had a good long time to think about why the rate sounded so terrible compared to their experiences so far. Elaine, however, was still twisting herself into knots over it. He went over to the dining room table where his wife was seated, placing a cup of water in front of her. She absently lifted it to her lips, then the cup fell and clattered against the table, spilling its contents over its surface. Paul frowned. "Baroness up and die again?" he muttered. That was another thing about this place. The noble in charge died from time to time. It wasn't a kid taking over after their relatives, afterwards, it was the same Baroness Saradnik, dying over and over again. With those deaths came a vague feeling of uncertainty and unease. Mishaps happened more often, people lost their usual level-headedness and several other minor things occurred as well. Then it would all vanish the moment she came back to life again. It had caused an unbridled panic at first, but, after a certain point, some of the villagers jokingly, at least he thought it was a joke, suggested they should start a betting pool for how long the Baroness would last until it happened again. Elaine turned her head at his voice, eyes wide and fearful. Her arm came out and clutched at his shirt. We need to run," she said. "Run?" He wrinkled his nose in confusion. "Why'd we need to?" She pushed the papers straight into his face. Paul flinched and he stumbled backwards. After a moment, he leaned forward, scanning the page. Not that he could read. Nor could Elaine, for that matter. They could make out numbers and a few words, but that was about it. "The number, Paul. The number." Elaine shook the page as he tried to make sense out of the jumble of letters. Scowling, he snatched it out of her hand so he could look at it properly. It was laid out like a merchant's invoice, listing numbers in fields with what he assumed to be the sum at the end. 141. He squinted at the numbers, looking for any marks stuck between them. 141 gold, 2 silver, 9 copper. Elaine nodded her head, cradling her swollen belly as she looked up at him tearfully. We're in trouble, aren't we?" she asked through quickening breaths. "This number isn't right. We need to get out of here before a death knight breaks down the door to take us away." Paul looked around his panicking wife at the table behind her. There was nothing aside from the booklet there. "Did you put the gold somewhere?" he asked. Elaine shook her head. "Wait, if you didn't get the gold, then why are we running? You think they'll take us away for having a piece of paper with a number on it? Where do you think we can go anyways? The harbor is the only way in or out." It was an absurd amount, honestly. Enough to make anyone think you were guilty of something. A family of 3 in the city could live comfortably on 3 gold a month, those living in rural areas could stretch it out even further. "Then what do we do?" Elaine asked him. "What can we do? We didn't do anything wrong, this is horrible, Paul." We just keep doing what we're doing," he answered. "I said how big the harvest was before, didn't I? But, look, how much did we pull in last year? T25? That was for both seasons, though." "Right," Paul nodded. "That was us working 1 hide of land. We got 4 of those skeleton farmhands, and each one of them can work about a hide of land. We've been granted 200 acres of land to tender for our contract. You get where I'm going with this? But that still doesn't seem right. Doesn't that mean we should be making 4 times as much for the year? It's going to be over tenfold at this rate. More than that, our old share was 3/10. The share here is only 1/10. They're using druid magic on the land, and yields gone from 7 bushels an acre to 30. We still use the same number of bushels to seed the next crop, so there's that much more that goes into what we make for the harvest. He wasn't sure if that was quite right. No, it should be. For the first season, Lady Zaradnik had included everything into their terms. They'd get their 1/10 share, free of any other costs. That means, we're rich? Elaine said, we can buy everything we ever wanted and still have coin to spare. We could live like nobles, and... Whoa, Paul shouted at her sudden reversal in attitude, just hold on a second there. Did they say anything when you went to the light tower? Something about an advisory? It's part of all those papers they gave us. That didn't help when neither of them could read. Paul furrowed his brow, flipping through the pages. It was all words and no pictures. Nothing else. He said, I need to walk over there and ask before you try buying a lordship. It busy when you left? Elaine shook her head. Line was short. Paul walked out onto the porch and pulled on his boots, heading out of his yard and up the street. He entered the market square, which was much busier than usual. A small crowd was gathered on the western side. There, a woman in a black dress was speaking to them while holding up something in her hand. He entered the light tower, taking his place at the end of a small group of people, all holding what appeared to be the same batch of papers in their hands. At the counter was the elder lich charged with seeing to the running of the village, staring out at the line. The villagers at the front walked back out after talking with it for a few seconds. Paul's turn came within a minute or so. The elder lich cleared its non-existent throat, glancing down at the papers in Paul's hand. I assume that your illiteracy has led you here, it said in a thin and nasally voice. That's right, I guess. Compared to Baroness Zaradnik's right-hand lich, the new one that had come to their village had a few rough edges. It looked him in the eye and sighed before speaking. The pages included with your record are an advisory concerning downwards fluctuations in commodity prices, particularly those for agricultural produce. The booklet is for use with the post office. He had no idea about the last bit, but the other part caused him to start in alarm. The prices are going down? Worry crept into Paul's voice. Why is that? It would stand to reason that, with the increase in supply, demand, and thus prices, will fall, yes? It is put simply, for your understanding. Well, the important thing for you to note is that, due to this fall in prices, an advisory has been issued addressing how your earnings should be put to use. You're telling us what to buy now? It is ultimately for your long-term benefit, and will save on your living costs in the long run. Paul supposed that he could at least listen to what the elder lich had to say. I'm listening. He leaned forward. Take your listening outside. The elder lich leaned back. A representative from the magical atelier is currently holding a presentation. Next. Paul wandered away and out of the light tower. Maybe the elder lich didn't have a few rough edges, it had a lot of jagged ones. Back in the market square, he made his way around to join the crowd in front of the stand. The woman in the black dress was a pleasant-looking girl who had moved in several weeks previous to work in some sort of magical workshop connected to the light tower. In her hand was a gleaming crystal sphere that drove away the shadows of the evening with its radiant light. Can't we just leave it on a table? A man raised his voice over the murmur of the crowd. I wouldn't recommend that, the woman replied in a patient tone. It is a magic item, after all, so you'll want to protect your investment with something sturdy and not prone to falling over and breaking. But it's already expensive enough. Why is it so fragile? Might as well buy something cheaper that won't break so easily. If you take care of it, the woman said, it'll last forever. Think of what you'll save on candles, torches and firewood. There'll be no smoke or soot, no heat, and no fuss. The man did not look convinced. No heat was hardly a selling point, either, especially with autumn coming in a couple of months. Paul looked around the crowd, searching for a familiar face. He found his neighbor, a fellow farmer, not too far away and edged through the crowd towards him. PSST, he lightly elbowed the man. What's going on here? "Ladies selling magic lights," his neighbor replied. "Says they'll make our homes as bright as day." Magic lights. Paul looked up at the gleaming sphere, so like the ones that they used to light the streets in Irantal. "Could be," the man shrugged. "They're expensive, though, 4 gold coins each, plus whatever you stick 'em in." That was no doubt expensive. The woman continued unfazed by the dull reception, extolling the virtues of the magical light. Though her reasoning about saving on lighting costs did make a sort of sense, its value depended on who was using it. A farmer like Paul had little need, he couldn't read, and most of his work was outdoors. He didn't spend much on candles, torches or firewood in the first place. A weaver, carpenter, or some other craftsman, however, would benefit from being able to work well into the evening and night. It was an item that meant clear profit for some, but parting anyone else with their gold would be difficult. The idea that it could break added to his hesitation, and it probably wasn't just him. Somewhere along the way, she added the fact that Lady Zaradnik endorsed the use of magical lighting in her domain and intended on using them to light the streets, just like they did in the city, which further lowered Paul's already low interest. If the streets and gardens were lit, then they could just go out and use those instead if they needed to. As expected, only craftsmen came forward to purchase the magical lights. It was enough to empty the woman's inventory, though, and her assistant, who Paul hadn't noticed up until that point, removed the empty crate and replaced it with another. The woman lifted the lid and withdrew a long black sheet of something. "Now our next wondrous item here is. Your attention is required." The thin, nasal voice of the elder lich boomed over the market square, and the crowd turned their attention away from the woman and up to the top of the light tower. "A Class B advisory has been issued for Zaradnik Barony and its surrounding environs," the elder lich droned down over the village. "His Majesty's subjects are restricted to their respective villages. All road travel is prohibited. Those found outside of their designated areas will be deposited at the nearest safe location by local security. Activity within population centers will not be restricted, you may go about your regular business within their bounds." With that, the undead office worker vanished back into the light tower. Another advisory. Paul was still trying to figure out what the previous advisory was. "Hey, Paul, what's a Class B advisory?" "I got no idea," he muttered. "Hey Isabella," someone shouted up to the woman on the stand, "what was the lich talking about?" Over the air, the sounds of the village gates being closed and barred echoed over the rooftops. It means that we're under threat of invasion," Isabella replied, then flashed a brilliant smile. "Well, now that you're all stuck in here with me, I'd like to bring your attention back to the next handy little magic item we got here." "That will be all, you may leave." The party of Iron Rank adventurers quietly filed out of the room, leaving Ludmilla to complete her reports for their training area session. Overall, they had done well, and she offered several constructive points where she thought the greatest improvements could be made in the near future. The fighter and ranger in the group appeared to be ready for martial arts drills as well, so she made the recommendation that they should do so in the time between their scheduled group sessions. "Woo, we survived," a voice drifted up the stairwell and through the open door of her office. My heart almost stopped when I saw her in the room. "No kidding, I was praying for Iron Sack on the way back." Ludmilla's pen stopped, and a furrow appeared over her brow. "Is she always like that? I thought we nailed it, but then she just ripped us apart." "Maybe she's just trying to be helpful. She's one of the first new platinum ranks in the guild, after all, she probably knows what we'll be facing in the future. Or maybe she just loves cracking the whip." Someone made a whipping sound, and the rest of the party laughed. "I dunno about the rest of you guys, but she can whip me any day. That whole feeling she gives off is just... Oh gods, don't you start now. Might as well aim for Nobby instead." No, you don't get it. We got no chance with Nobby, but Ludmilla is a noble. She's the head of her own house, so eventually, she's going to start thinking about having kids. She doesn't ever give off that feeling. Training, work, duty, that woman's just a big blob of boring. That's because she worships the Six, yeah? Those zealots don't consider themselves adults until 20, so they act like prudes until bam, the shackles come out. If you can line yourself up nicely beforehand, you've got yourself a rich and powerful wife. I bet you she'll stop adventuring around that time to pop out kids, and you could be the lucky one that helps her out with that." She'll be wild after holding out for over 5 years. HSST. What if she hears you? You're gonna get sniped the second you step out onto the street. Too late, Ludmilla thought. Not that she'd actually loose arrows at them from the office window. Possessing the enhanced senses of a ranger, which grew keener as she gained in strength, Ludmilla heard a great many things when people thought her out of earshot. Not all of it was so frivolous, of course, but it at least appeared that Isabella's assessment of Ludmilla's image was more accurate than she cared to admit. The door to the Adventurer Guild office opened, and the sounds of the Central District drifted up the stairwell along with the continuation to their conversation. You have to admit I'm right. Maybe. She might be all that, but that'll also mean she's super picky about cultivating strong bloodlines. You better train hard, she probably won't even give you the time of day unless you can beat her. Also, she doesn't have those curves, so she's just no match for Nobe. Yeah, but she's tall, those skirts of hers are probably hiding some amazing legs. Put some heels on her and who cares about the rest? Tilda. Step on me, please. Ludmilla stood up from her desk and walked over to the office window, peering down to see if she could pick out whoever had just spoken. One of the departing adventurers glanced up at the office window, but he somehow didn't notice her standing there. She watched them disappear down the promenade and out the southern gate with a frown. A note should probably be added that they became oblivious to potential threats when they thought themselves safe. She turned back to review her report and pack her things, deactivating the magic lighting before locking the door. A sense of curiosity tugged at her, and she went to the room at the end of the hall. Lord Mayor looked up at her approach. Thank you for your hard work. It's the least I can do to return the favor that you've shown me, Lord Mayor, she smiled. Has anything interesting happened? Ludmilla walked up to where Lord Mayor was seated, turning to examine a half-dozen mirrors of remote viewing set up in the room. He was using them to keep track of various parts of the adventurer expedition headed north to the Azalisia Mountains. They're still making their way through Tob Forest, he told her. It's all under the Sorceress Kingdom's control, so they're basically doing survey work for the proposed highway. What about those caves that are rumored to lead below the forest? She asked. None of the entrances are around where they are right now, Lord Mayor answered. The closest one is further north, near the border with the Empire. Lord Mayor's voice trailed off uncertainly, and Ludmilla looked away from the scenes presented by the mirrors. My lord? No, it's just something I heard from someone once, about a big underground system of caverns that spans the entire continent. I was thinking that maybe those are a part of it? I've never heard of the like, Ludmilla said. The caves below Tob are only mentioned as a part of the forest. If what you say is true, wouldn't that potentially mean that there could be a whole empire under the empire that we don't know about? Really? That sounds like trouble. Well, if no one's heard about this subterranean world, it either doesn't exist or they simply have no way or desire to come to the surface. If nothing has happened in our recorded history, then there shouldn't be any imminent worries. What about the adventurer training area? Lord Mayor's worried voice rose. I keep wondering if I'll accidentally dig into something that might cause problems now. You could just cover it right back up again if it happens, couldn't you, my lord? Maybe. We have no idea what's down there, so it doesn't hurt to be careful. Anyways, things look like they're going okay for now. The adventurers aren't randomly attacking the locals that they come across, and everyone is pretty helpful. What? Ludmilla looked down at Lord Mayor, wiping the growing frown that she belatedly realized had appeared on her face. I understand that they're still essentially in training for the expedition system, my lord, she said, but isn't this a bit too nice? I wouldn't expect this warm welcome from most of these demi-human and heteromorph tribes, or any sort of diplomacy, for that matter, unless they were either allied with the Sorceress Kingdom or faced with clear and overwhelming strength. Now it was Lord Mayor's turn to frown. He scratched his nose lightly as he appeared to ponder her words. Maybe we should set up some ambushes for them. I could go out and organize something, maybe. I'm not suggesting that we have our citizens attack them, Ludmilla said. It's just that this experience so far might set an incomplete precedent. If everyone is friendly, or at least neutral, to their presence, the adventurers' expectations will be similarly twisted. All these people that they're encountering would most likely be hostile to intrusion upon the lands that they depend on to live, if not for being subjects of the Sorceress Kingdom. There will also be those that will attack them because, well, humans are edible. The Azalisia Mountains haven't been subjugated yet, Lord Mayor offered, so maybe they'll be able to experience that once they leave the forest. I have every expectation that they will, my lord, Ludmilla said. I'm just worried that it will come in the form of something that is far too powerful for them to fight directly, and they'll be caught entirely unprepared since they'll have just left the forest with that mindset. It sets the stage for a catastrophe, as far as the Adventurer Guild is concerned. I'll remind the veterans leading the expedition, then they can convey what they understand from experience. That does seem like a more natural way to do things, Ludmilla agreed. They can work on what they know, which will give them a sense of ownership in their methods. It probably won't prevent disaster from befalling them if they encounter powerful opponents, but it should at least speed up the development of the appropriate procedures. I think so too. We'll be able to recover all the pieces even if the worst happens, so it'll be a good learning experience. Guildmaster Ironsack is going to cry tears of blood. Shaltir is sponsoring the expedition, Lord Mayor told her. Well, the Ministry of Transportation is. A bunch of us are in favor of her proposal for the Northern Highway, and Shaltir wants to see it succeed. I wasn't aware of that, my lord. Ludmilla wondered if her taxes were being used for that. Anyways, it's about time for dinner. I can send one of my maids here with some food if you'd like. Someone's already gone to pick up dinner for me. Thanks, though. In that case, Ludmilla lowered her head, I'll be heading down to hand over these reports with the Guildmaster. Have a pleasant evening, my lord. Ludmilla gave the mirrors one last glance. The adventurers being monitored really did look like they were on some relaxed excursion rather than exploring a potentially lethal environment. She made her way back down the hall, then down the flight of stairs to the first floor. Stepping outside, she turned north up the sidewalk and peered into the newly renovated training hall. The space was entirely exposed to street traffic, and several pedestrians could be seen observing the adventurers going through their drills within. Near one of the corners of the building, she found the Guildmaster. He was tapping the point of a practice longsword lightly on the floor as he gazed out over the dozen or so iron and silver-ranked adventurers. She fished out her written assessments on the training area sessions for the afternoon as she approached. Here are the reports for the afternoon, Guildmaster Ironsack. Good job, the Guildmaster said as he took the reports in hand. Seeing that they only walked out like whipped dogs, I assumed that everything went pretty well. That's they did do well, Guildmaster. Ludmilla thought they certainly didn't sound that way. I have no idea why walking out like whipped dogs would be any sort of indicator of that, though. Well, I figured that if they didn't, you just dumped their ashes out of the office window. Ludmilla restrained a sigh. Since her administrative duties kept her at home and around the city in the weeks surrounding the summer harvest, she couldn't join the ongoing expedition. Instead, she decided to help out a bit with the Adventurer Guild, as there were no teams for her to train within the time she usually set aside for her regular adventurer activities. The other proctors were out on the expedition, so she and the Guildmaster were taking turns assessing the performance of the lower-ranked members undergoing training during that period. With the additional time freed up by the Ring of Sustenance, she saw to house Zaradnik's business in the morning and the evening, assessed adventurer teams in the afternoon, and spent time training and reading up on promising subjects for development at night. It had barely been a week since she started, but the adventurers in training already appeared to view her as some sort of harsh taskmistress. It's not as if I shout at them, Ludmilla said. I have no idea why you all see me that way. The Guildmaster raised a hand to stroke his mustache. I think it's more that you only focus on what they should be addressing, and you don't mince words when they do. You pretty much never compliment them on anything that they do right, so it sounds like you're constantly attacking them for everything. Come to think of it, your father was the same way as well. Trying to get a compliment or anything beyond basic pleasantries out of him was like trying to socialize with Nobbe. Except he was a lot uglier than Nobbe. It's not hard to speak with Nobbe, she frowned. It's not? The Guildmaster frowned back. Of course not, she told him. I think we get along just fine. Some people just don't like frivolous communication. If you say so. Most people do like frivolous communication, though, so it wouldn't hurt for you to stroke their egos a bit. When it comes to adventuring or any other dangerous vocation, Ludmilla replied, that sounds like a good way to get people killed. They learn new things, gain confidence in their abilities, and receive their promotions. I find a life of honored service gratifying enough." The guildmaster barked out a short laugh, shaking his head with a bemused expression on his face. "Aura said something like that too," he told her. "I guess some people just have a different approach. Well, as long as they continue to improve, I'm more than happy with my rising popularity since everyone's so damn scared of you. When they see me walking into the office, their faces look like an angel just came down to save them." Guildmaster Ironsack stopped stroking his mustache, and his lips turned up into a sly smile. "Since you're here," he said, "how about you spar with the newbies for a bit? We don't have any other polearm users, so they could use the practice against one." 4 of the adventurers practicing nearby wavered and stopped, stealing glances towards where Ludmilla was speaking with the guildmaster. She eyed their equipment, then looked over at the others in the hall. 8 out of the 12 present used swords of various types, then there were 3 warhammers and a battleaxe. She supposed it was to be expected. The most common polearms that could be seen in the region were spears, which were viewed as the weapon of impoverished smallfolk and unskilled militia by the vast majority of adventurers. Though much had changed in the past few months, culture and common perceptions remained very much the same as generations went by, with nothing to forcibly alter them. Never mind that the Empire reportedly used it as the primary battlefield weapon for legions, and the adventurers that she sparred with could barely touch her, never mind best her. The nonsensical idea remained entrenched in their minds. Rather than demonstrating the benefits that came with using a polearm, all the results ever amounted to was another facet of her entirely undeserved reputation as a proctor and trainer, or perhaps a higher-ranked adventurer who would bully trainees that were so weak that she could do it in a dress. "I'd love to lend my assistance," Ludmilla told the guildmaster, "but I have an appointment in the scented quarter this evening." "I didn't know you were one for perfume." Guildmaster Ironsack raised an eyebrow. "I guess you're trying to soften that image of yours, after all." "Actually, it's an order for alchemical oils," Ludmilla told him. "The alchemist said she would be done filling a shipment of glass arrows this evening, so I need to go over and pick them up." She patted the infinite haversack strapped over her left hip, and the guildmaster sighed. "Figures. Well, you go ahead and have fun with that, I guess." "Thank you." She inclined her head slightly. "Have a good evening, Guildmaster."